سيداتي وسادتي، ستبدأ الآن الجلسة الخامسة تحت عنوان المآزق السياسية والاستراتيجية في أوروبا. Ladies and gentlemen, panel 5 entitled Europe's Political and Strategic Predicaments will start now.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Steve Clemons, and we are at the final session of today. On behalf of Dr. Ebtisam and I want to invite you all out to the front of the hotel when this is done for a 10K run. I'm just joking. But it is getting one of those days, and I hope you're enjoying the conversations we've had. We're going to discuss Europe's political and strategic predicaments now. We've got a fantastic panel. We have Nickolay Mladenov, who is the Director General of the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. Does he give you much instruction since he's around so much? No? Oh, you're independent, okay. We're going to test that. Paolo Magri is the Managing Director of the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. We have Stefan Mair, who is the Director of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And finally, Thomas Gomart, who is Director of the French IFRI, the French Institute of International Relations. So it's great. It's hard to imagine a more powerful group of directors of international institutes. But let me just start out here just for fun. If you were going to call to get a European voice from one of the great foreign policy research institutes in Europe, which one of them would you call?
Thank you for waking us up. I don't know. I'd probably call somebody in Washington.
That's a low blow.
What a start.
Yeah.
This is the beginning.
We didn't mention Chatham House, so it's...
This is the beginning.
Let me start out with Stefan and all of you. I want to ask something I've been thinking about, because we've seen, look, when you put it on the table, we've seen in a lot of European elections, often on populism. A populist wave, it's not always consistent. You can see Poland going a different direction. You can see Slovakia taken over by a sort of populist mood, as we just saw recently in Austria. And of course, we see this in the United States. And I've been interested in this notion about pugnacious American nationalism, whether there's a pugnacious Europeanism out there, or is it just lots of small little national populisms? Stefan?
I think it's more national populism. There's no really European...
So there's not going to morph into a kind of this European
there's
pugnaciousness?
At least one streaming who has, Orban said, make Europe great again. So that
right.
might be perhaps a nationalist populist movement. But I think for them it's very difficult to agree on anything. They really are very much focused on national issues. They refer always to the national level. And I don't see really the broad alliance of national right-wing
Paolo,
populists.
do you agree with that? Because I sort of get the sense from some new Italian leaders, there's sort of an interest in a European or pugnacious Europeanism.
But before I say something on that, I want to go back 1 second to the mood on Europe in this conference. And you actually supported that, saying, should I call someone, I will call Washington. We have been hearing since this morning, will Europe be around in 10 years' time? Every crisis in the world will have a terrible effect on Europe. First, let me reassure Ebtisam. In 10 years' time, Thomas, Stefan, and myself will be here again. We'll be here again as European, and Europe will be around. But since the atmosphere is rather gloomy, let me start with a joke. Do you have a second for a joke? We have a lot of joke in Europe. When we say heaven is where a German is an engineer, a French is a cook, and an Italian is a lover. And then you have hell. And hell is where the German is a cook, and I don't know who is the lover and who is the mechanical, but I don't know. So, and let me add some hell, confirm that hell is around us. Should you ask to us now, which of the three countries, France, Germany, and Italy, is the most stable politically in 3 years' time? the answer would be Italy. And if you ask which of the three countries has grown more economically in the last 3 years, the answer would be Italy. And this is the confirmation that we are in hell.
Yeah.
But that said, and this is a joke to de-dramatize the atmosphere that we are having on Europe, let me say that in spite of all the problems that were mentioned, and we can mention ourselves many other, we are, for European standard, working extremely hard to address all these external problems and the internal problem. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying that we have been around in the industry for 30 years. I have never seen such an intense production of ideas. Now, you could say ideas are not enough, you need to implement them, but there is also a sense of urgency in implementing. Final remark, will we implement all the ideas and all the plans? No,
Right.
but I've never seen Europe so aware of the need of doing something to run as fast as the other.
Well, thank you for that. Let me go to Thomas, because while I may have framed it as pugnacious Europeanism, what I'm really trying to get at is a sense of Europe's future, its competitiveness. We've seen the Draghi report, but a lot of this, and I never know which landmine I'm going to step on in Europe, but a lot of it started with President Macron's comments about the need for strategic autonomy and to begin thinking much more seriously about Europe's interests. And it seems that he's even doubled down on that since Donald Trump's re-election. But Thomas, I'm interested in how you see this terrain, strategic autonomy, this response of whether or not this orientation is going to lead to kind of a different approach, a different muscularity of Europe.
It's difficult to know for a French expert to speak about strategic autonomy. It's a concept I really understand, to be honest, even if it's coming from my president.
You don't understand it, or you
No,
do?
because I think it was more or less used in a not the proper way. Let me try to explain. I think that President Macron was right on one thing when he was elected in 2016. It was that war was coming back to Europe. The war, did not start in February 2022.
Right.
The war started in February 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. So already 10 years. And President Macron was in advance in his wish to accelerate the rearmament, the military rearmament, which was not very popular at that time in different European countries, except the eastern ones. So for me, the real inflection is 2017 in this regard. Now, it's very clear for all the European countries that, their defense and security is within NATO. So maybe you have the feeling that Europe is in bad shape. Now, this morning I had the impression that Europe, as it was said rightly by Paolo, was a sort of black hole. It's not really the case, to be honest. If you observe, the evolution, the transformation of NATO, for instance, with 2 new members, Sweden, Finland, if you observe also the unity, it was said in the previous panel that there is no more unity in Europe regarding Ukraine. I don't think so at all. So my point is just to say that strategic autonomy, it was coined to say, yes, we enter a very difficult period of time, but as Europeans, because we have many things to do together, we can react to that, we can counter that, and we should do that in our lines, I would say. Of course, with the alliance with the US, but also taking into consideration what is expressed by the Global South, to continue to invest loudly, on climate change, on the public goods, things like that.
Right.
So strategic autonomy should not be, misunderstood as a sort of old French idea. I think it's much more something which is to react to the new strategic context we face.
Real quick, Thomas, when you said that President Macron had gotten one thing right, you seemed on the edge of talking about the things he didn't get right. What were some of those?
Wow. No, he was re-elected, so it was not so easy. And I think that President Macron also, what is important, there is this concept of the new European policy community, which is an interesting one,
Right.
given the fact that it was a way to be back to the UK, to speak to Turkey, to speak to Caucasus countries and others, and the EPC, continue to work.
Right.
It's just a format with 44 countries which want to share things, to have strategic discussion on energy, for instance,
Right.
which is a move, which is really a move for the continent.
Stefan, I want you to jump in, and then I want to bring in Nickolay.
Yeah, I just wanted to try to explain Macron's concept to my friend Thomas, because
Because you're much more of a fan of right?
my idea about strategic autonomy is quite simple. It's the ability and willingness to make autonomous foreign policy positions and then to implement them. And for that, you need capabilities and capacities. And I think on both levels, we have shortcomings. We have a strategic compass, but not really a very much coherent European foreign policy. We don't have the decision-making structures to get there with our consensus principle. I think we made some progress with regard to our defense capabilities, with regard to our economic coercion instruments, but also there we have some.
So are you saying that Germany is willing to add more muscle to the strategic autonomy debate?
I think that the debate comes up again, because I think it started under the first Trump administration. Then, as Russia invaded Ukraine, we realized that our strategic autonomy is quite limited if there is a military aggressor in the neighborhood. And also we had Biden as benevolent hegemon, so to speak. And there was, I think, the discussion of strategic autonomy almost completely disappeared in these years. But now in the second Trump administration, it will come up again. I'm quite sure about that, that we have to talk
Nickolay, when I think of a country and its strategic choices, the way, this may be a simplistic frame, but I often think, does that set of factors make its own weather, or is it a victim of the weather of other places? And I'm interested in how you see Europe now in these choices. Do you see it as caught in a vice between forces, or is it able to exert pressure and power and follow its own course?
I think it's a combination of two, but I think there's also two perspectives to it. I mean, there's a relevance of Europe if you look at it from a European perspective inside Europe. And there's, I'm afraid to say, an irrelevance of Europe if you look at it from the outside.
Just because I always have trouble with that.
This has been the European perspective from the inside. But what I think we need to look also is not just the process.
Is it the same in Prague as in Paris?
It's not the same exactly, but it is within the same process framework. What I think we're lacking to see from the outside, sitting here in Abu Dhabi, for example, and looking at Europe, is Europe becoming much more assertive, not just about its strategic autonomy in terms of defense, but in terms of its own, processes in formulating foreign policy. Because if I want to find out what is the Italian foreign policy, I will call Rome, Germany, Berlin. But I need to get more of that. I need to see more unity in terms of foreign policy decision-making, not just on Ukraine. And I need to see more realization that Europe needs to not just build up its capacity in terms of its own defense and in terms of its foreign policy instruments, but it needs to a different understanding of the partnerships that it needs to develop beyond the scope of the immediate neighborhood of Europe, of its technological sovereignty. This is another debate which is not, still to start, if you wish, of its, the independence of its own supply routes and its, beyond energy and its own, less reliance on external actors. This is the whole concept of, I think, strategic autonomy. It is not just, let's have this or let's have that so that we can show to the Americans with the Trump administration that we can do it on our own. No, the transatlantic link will remain should remain as strong as ever, and it is critically important. But it is in these other aspects that we need to see Europe act more as a coherent foreign policy actor beyond the current crisis of Ukraine, for example. Let
me ask you, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the second Russian invasion, because I agree about the 2014, but talk about 2023, President Macron was out saying that NATO had become brain dead, that European security considerations were driven by inertia rather than planning, that there was just this moribund carcass of thinking going on. And it took the Russian second invasion, if you will, to reinvigorate NATO, to create, Isn't it a problem that the transatlantic relationship and NATO is dependent upon external threats as opposed to something that's more, I mean, I'm just interested in that because I got to tell you, watching that shift, when you talk about Europe's predicament, if you're going to be dependent for your unity for whatnot on that, I know, see, Stefan, going to jump on this in a moment. But let me get Nickolay a chance, and then Stefan, you got the second.
I was reminded by the previous panel of the Lisbon summit
Yeah.
of NATO, and if I'm not correct, I was Minister of Defense then, and part of the discussion then was, you know, how do we do out-of-area operations? How do we respond to cyber threats? How do we engage with Southeast Asia, et cetera, et cetera? But ultimately, NATO is a territorial defense alliance. That is the core of NATO. Right. So everything beyond defending the core territory of NATO is in addition to that mission. And in a way, unfortunately, you know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine revived that understanding among all allies within NATO that, you know, it is a territorial defense alliance. And that is where, you know, most of its efforts, if not all of its efforts, need to focus.
Everybody's got a two-finger. Stefan, Paolo?
No, I think Nickolay made the point. NATO is a defense alliance. It's only natural that it's got reinvigorated when there is an external threat to it. So, yeah, no additional remark on that.
I don't think the fact that our decisions are supported by external crises, as you mentioned, is an issue by itself. The point is to take the right decision when external pressure brings you in some direction. And I think Nickolay made a good point in saying that the real point for Europe is not to advance internally and to overtake internal difficulties, but to become relevant outside. And sometimes, and this is a good point, I think we Europeans are so proud of overtaking internal consensus on issue. Last night I was talking to James Lindsay, and he was mentioning that Trump may not be able to do what he wants because he has 44, 43 senators, and he has to get their consensus, to get on everything. Any decision in Europe has 27 head of states which are not of the same party and which go on their direction. So what we did from the internal point of view on Ukraine, what we did in the last 5 years, in the last few years, increased defense budget of 46%. 46%. Right. For us internally is incredible. It's incredible. But then the good point he made, how is that perceived outside? And on that, we have to work a lot. We are a little bit like, and then I conclude, Alice in Wonderland. You know Alice in Wonderland? Alice in Wonderland, when she arrives there, the queen tells Alice, welcome in Wonderland. You, in this place, in this land, you have to run fast, to stay still. Right. So sometimes the impression we give outside is that we run fast, but we stay still. And we have to work on that last mile a lot in the next year.
Thomas, you want to jump in?
Yes, maybe a couple of points. First, you know, there is someone from Italy, someone from Germany, someone from France. But the EU, I think the main evolution of the EU and NATO during the last 2 decades were its enlargement towards countries which on their own decided to join. You know, namely Poland, Baltic states, I won't list all of them. And that's very important. Why have they decided to do so? Because they feel very deeply European in terms of identity. They had the feeling that because of the Cold War, their European identity was stolen. And second, they wanted, you know, to be secured economically and militarily. And it was done in a sense. What is very interesting with the Russian attitude after, just before February 2022, was, you know, memorandum of December 2021 to say we want to be back to the situation of 1997.
Right.
And why? These countries were not forced to join NATO and the EU. They wanted to do so, and that was, you know, a way for them to get economic growth, to be able to have an adaptive and transformative political system, and so on. So I would insist on that just to remind that Italy, France, and Germany are, of course, historically very important for continental Europe, but Europe was able to transform itself. Second, and that's much more maybe a French idea or an idea very rooted in the French strategic culture, because of our history, and I have no time to elaborate on that, but we were able in France to anticipate the possible idea that the US will be less present on the European continent one day.
Right.
Maybe this day is coming. And that's why, strategic autonomy is so important. Do we adapt to that? Do we think that it would be a catastrophe? I don't think so. I think we can adapt. It will be a big change, but we can adapt. But that is certainly something on which we should work gently.
Thomas, let me ask you, and I mean this seriously, I am really interested in what strategy Europe, NATO, Europe on its own, pursues to not continually repeat history with Russia. It was discussed earlier. Richard Haas, if he were up here, the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, used to be in favor of finding a track for Russia to eventually become a member of NATO. And his view was if you didn't do that, you would constantly be recreating an us versus them cycle. I don't know how the us versus them cycle is ever broken in this case. And when you add to that equation, make America great again, Donald Trump, American pugnacious nationalism, that at the best in NATO, I mean, I know what protection rackets are. You charge your friends more money to be protected, right? So the cost of being a friend of the United States is going to go up. And I don't know how that's going to play in Europe. But I guess my question to you is, how do you escape that cycle? That's the predicament.
That's a very important question. I spent 20 years of my professional life to try to foster the relation between the EU and Russia. So what happened in February 2022 is a sort of personal failure, a deep one. So I start with that just to say that really I belong to those who thought that a strong partnership with Russia was possible. I should remind something, when Russia was less important economically than Portugal, Russia was invited, namely by Germany and France, to join the G8. Do you remember that? Russia was part of the G8. Before that, BRICS did exist.
Yes.
Also, you had, an agreement between Russia and NATO in 1997. So when it is said by Russia all the time that Russia was, humiliated, no, that's not true. Many discussions, within OSCE, many things were remind also what Blair tried to do with the NATO-Russia agreement in 2003 and so on. The point is that France, Germany, and Russia were right in their analysis about what happened in Iraq in 2003.
Right.
And for France and Germany, it was very difficult to accept that maybe, Russia was turning bad. And on that, Poland, Baltic states were right, the UK as well, were right on the assessment of the turning point of Russia. And this turning point, in my opinion, can be dated, in 2012 with the Bolotnaya events and when Putin came back to the Kremlin after having been prime minister.
Right.
And his decision to some extent to go to Syria, red line, by the US administration, to use this vacuum and to go, as I said, initially with annexation of Crimea. And at that time, we were more or less like that. No, it's not so important. Crimea was a Russian land. No, the real idea of Putin since that time, since 1 decade, is to completely transform the European security architecture. And now the problem for Europeans is to understand that there are 3 countries having a military entente, in Ukraine: Russia, North Korea, and Iran. By the way, the 3 most sanctioned countries in the world, supported by China. So we do understand now that China is not really, very cooperative and very positive in terms of European security. And just a final word, on North Korea, because it was the point was touched upon this morning. Do you remember that President Trump explained to us that he will solve the situation in the Korean Peninsula in 1 day? He said that, I don't remember precisely, but 2019, something like that.
Yeah.
So 6 years later, we have North Korean troops fighting in Europe.
Right. Nickolay, I know you want to jump in, but with whatever you want to say, I want to add one thing. We've seen reporting in the last few hours that Donald Trump has already talked to Vladimir Putin about Ukraine. We know that they talked something about territory. and allegedly Donald Trump said, hey, don't escalate things. I don't know. I mean, there was a report that Trump had already talked to Macron briefly, but I'm just really interested in, one, I don't, you know, is Donald Trump freelancing? Are you have concerns that Ukraine may be sold out? I'm just sort of interested in this moment and what you think the ramifications are of a not yet inaugurated president already talking to Vladimir Putin on a resolution of Ukraine.
Well, we've all seen those reports and their denials, so I don't know what's true or not, but I think two things need to be said. One is that there's a lot of fear in Europe that a Trump administration is going to jump to some quick arrangement with Russia that will leave Ukraine hanging.
I think they're worried
in
about
a situation.
appeasement. I think they're worried about appeasement.
Right, but that situation can either be a frozen conflict in the East or worse. I do believe, however, that President Trump has a lot of tools that he can use to actually try and find a solution to this crisis right now. If he plays his cards correctly, the United States is a main supplier of weapons to Ukraine. It has a lot of leverage through that, both on Russia and on Ukraine. And let's see how that plays out. But going back to the previous question, I think it's important for us to remember that there used to be a big architecture of Europe-Russia relations. It wasn't it wasn't a very simple architecture. It was quite complicated. Russia was part of the Council of Europe. It subscribed to the European Convention on Human Rights. There was a structured EU-Russia dialogue on all issues. There was a structured NATO-Russia dialogue at various levels. So you still have the OSCE. You had a very concerted effort led by Angela Merkel in Germany to integrate Russia into economic dependence with Germany in particular in Europe that was designed to engage them more in towards the West, if you wish, in that sense. Perhaps where mistakes were made or more could have been done is really restructuring the OSCE, which had become a very, very stale organization, and also making sure that this economic outreach from Germany to Russia didn't sort of jump over the whole of Central and Eastern Europe to the benefit just of the German economy, but it has somehow integrated.
My reading of history, and Cliff Kupchin knows it much better, and I think Andrei Kortunov, but during the Obama administration, he got so disgusted of dealing with Putin, he pulled the plug on most of those things that the U.S. was involved in or part of. And I think one of Russia's complaints was we were creating all of that architecture with China, but not with Russia. People can debate that, but Stefan?
No, let me say a few words on the enforced peace agreement. I think because it would not only be bad for Ukraine, but very bad for Europe as well, because it would encourage an aggressor who invaded a country being able to keep that occupied territory. What does it mean for the future? And it certainly brings Russia in a hegemonial role in Europe. And this, in connection with the remarks we already get about the qualification of Article 5 of NATO, would expose Europe to a threat which is really very difficult to deal with. And so I think any kind of enforced peace agreement on Ukraine would be very bad for Europe as a whole.
Paolo, can I jump to you for a second?
Can I say on Ukraine?
Yeah, and then I got another question.
I think on Ukraine, I've tried to be positive before, but on Ukraine and Europe, I'm quite pessimistic, whatever happens. Because if there is no agreement, if Trump is saying that we'll have an agreement, but it doesn't find an agreement with Putin, we will have war and possibly an escalated war, and that's a terrible scenario. If we have an agreement, we have peace, which is very much in favor of Putin, as you said, Europe would have lost, and we would have someone invading, accepted around us. But even if we have a decent peace, a decent agreement, Europe will end up paying for it, paying for security of Ukraine. Trump may not want to have NATO involved, which means a bilateral agreement by European states, which will have to put a lot of money, and paying for the European accession of Ukraine. I'm sure in the deal with Ukraine there might be no NATO but European accession. And European accession, in spite of all the rhetoric that we have in Europe, will be extremely expensive and extremely divisive within Europe. If the Polish, which are the strongest supporter of Ukraine, complain about the Ukrainian grain without tariff, can you imagine having Ukrainian grain with no tariff and on top receiving the money from the European agricultural policy, which will be a disaster for the agriculture industry in Europe. So I'm saying that we have to be very careful and cautious because whatever happens on Ukraine, we will find ourselves in a tough situation.
Okay, Thomas?
Pardon me?
No, Thomas.
Yeah, just a point to follow on what was said by Paolo. You know, for me, regarding the situation in Ukraine right now, 2 key points. The first one is the real strategic surprise for me. It is the level of Ukrainian resistance, which was supposed to be defeated in 3 days, you know, and it's not the case. So Ukraine gained, in my opinion, its real independence, even if it's very costly. But, you know, this special military operation led by Russia was supposed to last, you know, a couple of weeks. And now we are in an attrition war, which is more and more supportable, of course, for Ukraine, but also for Russia in terms of casualties. Second, I think that, you know, for Russia, in my opinion, has failed militarily in Ukraine, but succeed diplomatically. And that's very, very well done to some extent, because Russia appears to be a sort of leader of the so-called global south, whereas it is a colonial power, you know, acting under its nuclear protection. And it appears to be seen, you know, as a sort of leader of the so-called global south. So well done on that. But the key point is, in fact, that this protracted war, we can think about different scenarios. There were some of them very interesting for the discussion between Cliff and Andrei before. The ceasefire, but the other issue is why should we think that Russia will stay quiet after a ceasefire, you know? Russia stayed quiet between 2014 and 2022, but decided to go. So for Europeans, especially for Eastern ones, there is a high level, you know, of attention and of danger.
Nickolay?
Very brief point on that. I think Europe, whatever the ceasefire or no ceasefire, end or no, at some point this war will end in some way or form. Whatever point that happens, Europe needs to, I think, very soon understand that for the foreseeable future, the relationship between Europe and Russia is on a downward spiral. And that means that Europe needs to restructure its entire defense capabilities, its procurement process in defense, its all of its industries, in order to make sure that it has a credible deterrent against a future invasion from the East. Because without a credible deterrent in Europe against a future invasion of the East, whether this war in Ukraine ends now or in a year, that threat is going to grow towards
So what
Europe.
Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, at least a year ago, were saying a credible deterrent are all these bilateral deals, as opposed to NATO.
No, a credible deterrent means actually the capability, the
agree?
capacity, and the willingness to use force in the case of attack.
So let me ask you a question. If you know, I hang out with a lot of Eastern Europeans. You know, Slovenia, Latvia, Riga. You know, the Balkans, the Baltics, and you mentioned Poland, etc. And we've got, you know, the giants of Western Europe here. And without casting blame, and maybe I've got it wrong, but I sort of feel like the waters are rougher in Eastern Europe around Russia, Ukraine, what to do. Also disinformation campaigns. We've had so many elections going on in the region. You just feel the intensity of the consequence of what's going on in Eastern Europe more than you do in Rome and Paris and Berlin. Is that a problem in Europe? Stefan?
No, I wouldn't say that that's a problem. It certainly has increased the relevance of these countries for Europe, but I still think for making progress in developing Europe institutionally, you need the old major powers as well. But I think we, for many years, ignored what the Baltic and the Central Eastern European states were telling us about what Russia might do at the end. And we, I think, were taught a quite important lesson, to listen more and to include them in the decision-making process. And I have the impression this has really taken place in the past years. And this is, I would say, strengthening Europe and not really...
So Paolo, I want to ask you a question.
Let me put it this way. On wars, Europe has always got divisions. Iraq, France, and Libya, we were on opposite side.
Right.
But we managed to run that, okay? If Trump and Putin take the wrong decision on this war, it could be completely different. Because for many countries, this war is their war.
What does Viktor Orban do?
Sorry?
What does Viktor Orban do?
It's not only Viktor Orban.
Does Viktor Orban matter?
Is on one side, but you mentioned at least 10 countries which would be very...
Paolo, let me ask it this way. About 2 months ago at the GlobeSec Summit in Prague, Ursula von der Leyen said, I want to speak to those leaders in Hungary who blame Ukraine for the invasion by Russia in Ukraine. She said it's like blaming Hungarians for the invasion of Hungary by the Soviets, or looking at certain Czech leaders, not in power now, but other Czech leaders, and saying, hey, it's like blaming the Czechs for the... And she really threw down the gauntlet on the issue of Russia. Now, this happened before the US presidential election. Is she alone at the end of a plank now, or is she strongly supported in those views?
Someone mentioned before in the previous panel that she's not alone, but there are several countries which are considering a ceasefire and some kind of agreement as a necessity or a possibility. But I wouldn't say she's alone. But I would say, as we were saying, that there are countries which consider themselves at war with Russia, some Baltic states and so on, countries which are in favor of whatever happens, Hungary, and countries which are supporting Ukraine but are not excluding right now the possibility of an agreement, a decent agreement, but an agreement. So.
Well, can I take off my diplomatic academy hat and put my Bulgarian hat on?
Yeah, please be
just
Bulgarian.
For a second.
How Bulgarian can you be?
I can be very Bulgarian.
Okay, great.
So, just 2 points on this. You know, Western Europe has a complex because of its colonial history with Africa, the way that Central and Eastern Europe has a complex because of its own colonial history on the receiving end with the Soviet Union and Russia in the past. And you can't escape from this dynamic. Everybody from Estonia to Bulgaria, including in Hungary, understands that when there's an army that is not part of your alliance getting closer to your border, and when you have a history of this army, you know, running in and out of your country a number of times, you know, that creates a problem, and that will create an atmosphere in the part of the European Union which will be very fearful of any agreement or any arrangement in Ukraine that allows for this front line to get closer and closer to your border. Now, the situation looks rather different if you look from it from Paris, Berlin, or, you know, no disrespect, from Rome or from the western part of Europe. But you need to balance that attitude, and the only way to balance that attitude is actually to take on board all views of the 27 and come together to an agreement on what policy is possible. And that is what, for now, Ukraine is the best example of where Europe's unity in terms of foreign policy has worked, where its institutions, its nation, you know, member states, everybody is aligned with different opinions, with all of it, but aligned. Now, right. We need to see more of that, you know, unity empowered on other topics related to foreign policy and the geostrategic presence of Europe outside of the Ukrainian conflict.
And
Thank you.
I would say Viktor Orban and also Fico, they are opportunists who try to maximize the gains they can get by the positions they take. But at the end, they know that they ultimately, their security depend on NATO and that they are defended by the other partners.
Right.
So I'm quite sure that they will adjust their positions fairly soon.
Stefan and Thomas, I'm going to ask you a question. Recuse Paolo for a moment and then bring him in on another Italian, Mario Draghi. and the Draghi report, which I find really interesting because it really, if you read the Draghi report, for those of you who have not looked at it, it's on looking at how Europe can be great again, essentially. Competitiveness across a lot of issues. The area that most interested me, which I was unaware of, was the sense that European capital markets, if they didn't lag so much, if they weren't so inefficient, if they were more developed, could help pay for investments in national security at a higher level, help pay for climate change remediation. I thought it was a very informed report, but I've seen these reports. You know, Ursula von der Leyen had a competitiveness report. You shared with me that Letta had a report, et cetera. There are a lot of reports kind of looking at this, but as there's a greater sense of possibility in Europe, populism is growing along with it. So I'd love to get your sense of whether the Draghi report matters in this arena, if it helps provide a roadmap for how Europe might up its game.
Who are you asking this to me?
Yeah, no, not them. No, I'm keeping you out of it.
Okay, so no, I have a real problem in...
yeah, I know, the sound is complicated.
In understanding, yes. So sometimes I don't answer to your question because I don't understand the question.
I got to go to the non-Italians first, and then the Bulgarians.
I think there's a very broad consensus in Europe on the Draghi report. I think the question marks we always have is how much it will be implemented, and this is the issue. I think there's nothing new in this Draghi report. What he wrote in an excellent manner, I think is consensus. We have some issues, certainly, how to implement it. One is on European debts, the research of Eurobonds.
So I'm hearing it's okay, but you're not impressed yet.
Pardon me?
It's okay, but you're not impressed yet.
I didn't get
you. See?
Yeah, it's hard to hear.
It's okay, but you're not impressed.
Thomas knows what I'm saying.
No, I was impressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we agree on the assessment made by the Letta and Draghi reports. Now we should implement that. We should work harder, I think, in Europe. The big transformation, in my opinion, it is energy. It was said during the morning, energy is power.
Yes.
And the big consequences of the war in Ukraine, it is the rupture of the energy links between Russia and Europe. That's a big change, because now Europe is obliged to import much more expensive gas and oil. That's a fact. That's explained partly the inflation, not only, but partly. And that's very related to the lack of competitiveness, especially, for the industry in Germany, in Italy, less in France. So for me, the real issue is the fact that Europe will all the time need some energy from abroad, except the energy which it can produce itself. So that's why, I'm in favor of nuclear. We reinvest massively on nuclear plants, in France now because of that. Of course, green energy is supposed also to be deployed, and it will be done. And to some extent, the positioning of avoiding, in the future, massive oil and gas importation is the proper positioning. But during this period of time, it's highly expensive. It is. Mm-hmm. That's why it's so difficult right now in economic terms for Europe. But the move has been made to some extent. Second, in terms of if you observe, the 101st, capitalization in the world, the US is very ahead. Europe is second. We have many European companies doing very well, abroad. Very global companies. In terms of innovation, there are many things with the universities, the different ecosystems. We spoke this morning about IA, but have a look about what is produced on IA, for instance, in Paris, in Berlin, in London. That's impressive, So I'm rather optimistic on that. As soon as we are able to work more seriously, and to find a proper coordinated approach for energy supplies.
You wanted to jump in, Nickolay?
No.
Oh, you don't? Okay, good. Stefan, did you want to jump in again? No, okay. Let me ask you another interesting element, it's sort of in the economic space on Europe, and again, thinking about its Oh, and Paolo, I forgot to go to you. I did want to give you a chance to comment on Draghi. Is he your friend?
If it were an academic paper, it would win the Nobel Prize. meaning its citation index would be 2 million in 2
Yes.
weeks. In Italy, but not only in Italy, you mentioned that everywhere you go, you talk the Draghi report, like Karl Marx, The Capital. I wonder if someone read it, but everyone talks about it.
Right.
But the point is that it's not an academic paper. It's a document, like, you know, when you are a chairman of a company, McKinsey or BCG comes in, they make an assessment, and then they give you a report. You have to do this
Right.
to survive. To come back in 10 years to EBTESAN meeting, Europe has to do this.
Right.
Doing what is in the plan is tough. And one issue, the most important issue that makes it tough is that it's a cultural revolution. The point behind the report is Europe has to understand, European country has to
Right.
understand that their competitor is external, not internal. That we don't have to worry by the German or the French or the Bulgarian, but by the Chinese, the Indian or the Russian or the American.
Yeah, it's about collective
And then money,
competition.
money.
Right.
Because it's not a huge amount of money. It's less than the stimulus China did 2 days ago, or Biden did with IRA. It's less than that. But some countries don't want to have common borrowing. Some country wants to have common borrowing. And if we don't have common borrowing and we have to pay with national debt, what we have to do, we have no way.
Yeah.
We have no money. You know, the Minister of Finance in Italy presented the budget for 2025. He closed a few hospitals, a few schools, and said, so far it's good. Should we have to pay more for defense? There is no money for anyone. That was the announcement. So can you imagine looking at the future with all what we have to do? This is not only...
Right. Well, I'm a fan of the report. You should invite me to Europe to talk about how great that
Please,
report
come.
is. You know, it can be the outside perspective. Let me ask you another question about the economic side of this, which often doesn't come up in foreign policy, national security discussions, but it really does matter. Companies like Palantir, Google, Facebook, the big digital platforms, these are the most I mean, they're bigger than countries. And Europe turns out to be a regulatory superpower. I interviewed the former High Minister for Single Digital Economy in Europe, and I said, you know, why aren't you Europeans making a Facebook or a Google? And he said, no, you Americans innovate, we regulate. And it raises this interesting question on whether that, and you know, a lot of people laugh, but actually there's a lot of power in regulation and setting up guardrails. As we're looking at AI, you're looking at how we're going to deploy these technologies, what the border is with safety. It's another dimension of national security and foreign policy that's neglected and usually siloed away. So I'm unsiloing it. I'm going to go to my German friend and say, you know, what's the SVP's report on Europe as a regulatory superpower in the digital space and how it impacts national security?
I think the challenge is that now the innovation in the digital space is so fast that it's almost impossible to regulate. To regulate the innovation 2 or 3 years ago. And in the meantime, you have a new, total new digital space. And I think this is one of the challenges we certainly have, and which weakens also the regulatory power of Europe. And then also innovation is of global nature, so to speak. So the impact Europe can have on this is limited compared to those kind of regulations we have had in the past. So I think this is the challenge for the regulatory power of Europe.
Thomas?
Yeah, that's a key issue, because for me, you know, the last election in the US was won by Elon Musk, namely. And I'm very interested, you know, in the last statement by J.D. Vance to say that we should escape from NATO if DCA and DMA will continue, which is absolutely fascinating. Just intellectually to link pure security issues with regulation taken by the EU, that's fascinating. And that's, you know, reflecting that, yes, indeed, the EU has a normative power. Also, you know, the links between Vance and Peter Thiel. So these 4 guys have a very particular vision of the future, and they are very worried when Europeans said, yes, That's very important to be innovative, but also that's very important to have a political point of view on that. You know, I am on Twitter since 2008. Since 1 year, when I see the X links, you know, it's I don't know how to qualify and to be polite, but you know, I see video of people fighting each other all the days. I can imagine, you know, the impact of these things, you know, on young brains. What does it create, like representation of the world? So yes, there is a need for regulation. Do you want all to become completely stupid by using, you know, artificial intelligence or social network? I don't think so. So it's very often said that yes, the US innovates and the EU is only able to regulate,
Right.
but it's important to regulate. Maybe we prefer to be completely dominated by technology. It was said this morning very widely. I don't think so for any type of political regime. I mean, there is need for rules for this sort of instrument which are so powerful.
And you're better at the rules than we're making them.
I think this is one of Europe's real superpowers, because it is, and it is not just in this field, but particularly in this field, I think it's very important for the European Union to retain the power to actually put some rules in place, particularly on artificial intelligence, before that GDPR, etc., because it creates a model. And I think it's part of the European model in which you actually allow innovation, free movement of capital, goods, etc., but you also put in place protections for rights, for personal information, etc., Now, that is perhaps not a model that you can export to the entirety of the rest of the world, but it is worth having this model in Europe because certainly it creates a benchmark for many others, and as we can already see, other parts of the world.
How strong is that model? If J.D. Vance, the incoming vice president, says maybe the United States should pull out of NATO for how Europe is treating Elon Musk and Twitter.
Politicians
how
say all
strong
kinds
is
of
that
things.
will?
Politicians say all kinds of things, but you know, ultimately, when you crunch the numbers, you will see that it is not that easy to pull out because of this. I think in this particular example, where I'm a little bit concerned with is that the rate of innovation, particularly with artificial intelligence, is so fast that over a longer period of time, while protecting individual rights and privacy, etc., Europe will end up being overtaken by other parts of the world. China, perhaps the United States, perhaps even the Gulf here, the UAE, other parts of the world where these limitations don't exist. And I think Brazil, another interesting example to look at. And that will lead to a lag and delay in Europe. And in a way, we've seen a model in the past with, where Europe was leading on up until 3G, I think. And after 3G, sort of the European lead was handed over to others. I mean, we should not allow that model to be repeated.
Right. Paolo, you wanted to jump in?
No, not on this issue.
Okay, not on this issue. We're going to go to the audience in just a moment, but I guess I would say one other thing on this digital front, again, coming back to it. I have some friends that I know that are watching from Ukraine today, and I don't know which anniversary November 19th is, but it may be something like 1,000 days of hardcore fighting, etc., I was told. But what is interesting, again, in war and national security and kind of looking at Europe, if you want to kind of look at Ukraine has changed the way wars are fought. I mean, you look at the digitalization of the battlefield. If you look at autonomous decision-making, the application and synthesis of AI, big data, information, real-time in a battleground situation, it's pretty extraordinary. And I talk to U.S. generals and admirals that say the United States today doesn't have the same capacities in force in a kinetic conflict. And you're right on the edge of this happening. And I'm just sort of interested in, we used to talk about here, the Chinese and Americans talk about revolution in military affairs. There's revolution in military affairs going on right now in the conflict with Ukraine and Russia. Whether or not this becomes, another kind of opportunity for Europe to figure out how it adds some of that muscle and capacity, which is unique and new to its portfolio. Thomas?
We do a lot of research on that at E3, I suppose, like in ITSP or in its WP. what is important to be noted is the fact that, yes, you're right, there is a lot of innovation, use of artificial intelligence, with a lot of mistakes, which is something which could be observed also with Israel and Gaza. So the question of the human control remains very important in this regard. So yes, there is some sort of completely new things and also completely archaic things. People are fighting in trenches, and the support from the back is absolutely critical. The national cohesion is absolutely critical. Just this point, you know, for our professional armies, it was something less important in the last decades. Now it's no more.
Right.
So my point on warfare in Ukraine, it is just to underline how Ukrainians were reactive, able to innovate with a complete asymmetry. Of course, Russia learned very quickly also. The role played by external players like, you know, Starlink is also very important, coming back to my initial points, you know, on Musk and Trump. But I think that for me, what is the most important thing, you know, it is the level of attrition on both sides.
Right.
Yeah.
Russia is in very difficult position to mobilize again. Of course, Ukraine is also. So the consequences for all Europe, including Russia, it is the fact that Europe, and that's maybe the big transformation, you know, when we are in Abu Dhabi speaking with other representatives from everywhere. Europe lost its main competitive advantage at the global level, which was its strategic stability. And it's really a turning point because Europe was able to produce peace between its members since 1957. That's the beauty of the European project. But now the war is coming back on the European side. And that's why also we are so criticized, because for people coming from all over part of the world, it is to say, well, that's usual for us. You are coming back to a sort of all normality to some extent.
Right.
So it's really for us a turning point, including, as I said, also for Russia.
Stefan?
Just wanted to add one argument, because I read an article recently in Foreign Affairs, which was saying that it's not only about high-tech, but also producing great numbers of this high-tech means. And this is another weakness of Europe, because we haven't really done that much progress in building up a European defense industry and defense capabilities. And this is, I think, where we really have to focus on. And
Is there awareness of it?
awareness is there.
Awareness, yes.
There are also some efforts there, but
Difficult.
by far not sufficient.
Very difficult.
Paolo?
No, it's the defense industry coordination, let's put it this way. It's the need is well known, but the will is still not there. It's that I mean, that's where we have still have problems. You know, there was in the air a merge between a German and an Italian bank. A German bank which was sold, and an Italian bank, which is the most German Italian bank, who wanted to buy the German bank. And that became an issue between the two governments. Can you imagine merging two tank producing company from Italy or France and Germany? It's still a very sensitive issue. So we talk a lot about that, but this is still, you were defense minister, weren't you?
Yeah.
So it's still very, very difficult.
So, Nickolay, before you answer, which I want you to do, I want to ask Paolo, you know, do you find that, I don't know how to put this, that as fear or concern about the U.S. not being there for Europe's dark days, as much as it might otherwise be, does that increase the will? And I ask this with regard, we have some folks from Asia here. I often wrote that, you know, Japan and Korea, two allies of the United States, had what I considered to be, you know, they considered them to be huge, historically based grievances that would just rage on forever, and I found them strategically silly and reckless. And as fear grew, as they began hedging their bets, all of a sudden Japan and Korea are getting on. So as you begin pulling away, if you have someone guaranteeing the situation, you can be more reckless. But as you're pulling back, does that increase the will? In other words, is Donald Trump's Make America Great Again nationalism maybe a good thing for political will?
There is a positive narrative, which is exactly what you said. It's good, Trump is back. because Trump will help us overtake this problem. The negative narrative is the one which you were implicitly asserting a few seconds ago when you said, okay, but what about the vice president going around Europe and saying, if you don't do this with Elon Musk, I don't do this with you. It's the blackmail that Trump could do with us, with everyone. But you know, when you blackmail Xi Jinping or Trump or Putin, you have to sit on a table and you have on the other side someone as big as you, as tough as you. When you blackmail Europe, first of all, you have to find which table. You start asking him, would you call Paris, Rome, or Berlin? No? Okay, and he said Washington, which is the famous Kissinger mantra. We don't have that now, but if you blackmail strongly a continent made by 27 countries, not 52 senators, 27 countries, we will find someone who will say, okay, if you blackmail us saying, if you don't follow me on China, in decoupling China, I will put tariff on you. You will start having a few countries say, okay, let's consider that. If you blackmail other countries, say, if you don't pay for defense in Ukraine and you don't get Ukraine into Europe, I will have tariff on you. You will have a few countries saying, okay, let's consider that.
If you blackmail us, we'll bring back Huawei. Make it fun. I can give you good headlines. Nickolay?
Well, I think with or without Donald Trump in the White House, Europe needs to do all of these things out of its own self-interest, and it has needed to do all of these things for a very long time. We look at the strategic compass. It's been in the making, sitting around desks in Brussels for quite some time. It came out very, very quickly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you actually read it carefully, it has a beautiful blueprint of what Europe should be doing in the defense sector. It just needs to be implemented. Europe can't rely only on who's in the White House to decide its own fate. It just needs to decide its own fate,
right?
With or without, you know, without it mattering who's in the White House. But that's why, but as it does that, it needs to also reinforce the importance of the transatlantic relationship, because the transatlantic relationship is not, I don't believe it's going to be traded over a tweet. It is going to be far more difficult to disentangle than that. I don't think it really helped in this particular case that a certain European commissioner decided to come out with a long statement about Trump's debate.
You're making me tell one quick. Go ahead, finish real quick.
Elon Musk's debate, which he hosted on Europe. I don't think that helped. That should not have been done.
One little fun vignette. I was at the Halifax International Security Forum a few years ago with then Secretary of the Navy, Richard Spencer, who was involved in some legal issue with one of the Navy guys, and he said, he spoke with some journalists, including myself, and he says, I do not believe that a tweet is an official order from the President of the United States. And then he called me at midnight that night and says, guess I was wrong. A tweet can be an official order from the, and he resigned that night. Anyway, so you never know about those tweets is all I'll say. Let's go to the audience. We've got my friend Hani Fendakli. Hani?
Thank you very much, and thanks for an excellent discussion from this panel. My question, as usual, is about economics, and I want to talk about the economics of Europe. And the fact that it is and has not been discussed by the panel in a spiral decline, at least in relative terms. Europe's GDP was almost equal to that of the United States back in 20 years ago. It is today only about 70%. It was about 5 times the size of China's economy.
Right.
Today it's smaller than China's economy. So using Steve Clemons' analogies of strategic autonomy, pugnacious economy, or fragmentation, which way is Europe likely to deal with this issue, both within Europe itself and in terms of the transatlantic relationship?
Terrific.
Thanks.
Who wants to jump on that? Paolo?
I would send him a copy of the Draghi report. If you share a business card later, I will send you because I mean that's mainly the topic of the Draghi report and the Letta report. The two reports are mainly on that, and they draw on what Ursula von der Leyen in her first commission worked on. So again, on this issue, we have clear in mind what needs to be done. The issue is just implement it.
And that the demographics are quite different from Europe and the United States. So we have stagnating population in Europe, which
and we're trying. The United States is trying to get a stagnating population.
Pardon me?
We're really trying to shut down, get a. But I'll say to Hanny real quick, because it's something. The really interesting thing about that is, and I think it's part of the great global game, if you look at where the net add is in the rising global middle class, it's not in Europe, it's not in the United States, it's in Africa, it's in South Asia, it's in part of Latin America. And part of it, when you look at what China is putting a lot of emphasis on, it's basically, that's Belt and Road, or those are the various interesting things. The United States is trying to play catch up now. I don't know where Europe is in that, but it raises really interesting questions of when you look at market power and reaching consumers of the future that are going to pay for all this, how well deployed Europe is in the rest of the world. It'll be another great session, Eptisam someday. Let's go to Martin Wilhelm. Martin?
Thank you. As we're approaching the second, I'm here.
Okay.
As we're approaching the second Trump administration, my question is, how well did the Europeans deal with the first Trump administration and the challenge it posed? And as part of that, I would say one of the trickiest things about Donald Trump as president is the fact that he would probably not describe himself as much of an intellectual. However, what
he does describe himself as an intellectual.
Well, that's even better.
No, there's no doubt he describes himself as an intellectual.
That's even better. Yeah. But he
doesn't make it true. Doesn't make it true.
No, exactly. Whether you believe he's an intellectual or not, the challenge he poses in the US as well as around the world is deeply intellectual, I think. And in my view, one reason why the Democrats failed in the last election was they could not get their heads around the intellectual challenge Trump posed. Did we ever see it that way in Europe? Did we grasp the intellectual challenge in Donald Trump?
Nickolay?
Well, that's a great question. I suppose the answer is no, we didn't, because I don't think we sort of broke it down into sort of things you can measure. Can we increase defense spending, for example? This was before Ukraine, obviously, to please, quote unquote, Donald Trump.
But can I challenge you for a minute?
But what we didn't, I think, do was understand that there's a fundamentally different way of thinking developing in the United States, in parts of America, in parts of the American political establishment, parts of the American voters, that we need to adapt our narrative to in order to get across. I don't think we did that. And thirdly, I think, in particular in terms of foreign policy, we remain very much preachy, which I think overall, with or without Donald Trump again in the White House, that doesn't help Europe's collective foreign policy as a whole. So I think in that sense, we didn't really understand what was happening. We thought it was more of a blip rather than a long-term.
In the most respectful way, the only way I would push you on that, and I'm not sure how strongly you feel this, is I think one of the mistakes many people in the strategic class make is they don't understand Brexit mattered.
Yeah.
Rising populism matter. Le Pen matters. Orban matters. Fico in Slovakia and Pellegrini matter. And so those people are communicating. And it's just like in the United States. You know, we have a lot of people that are not connected with the Northeastern liberal establishment that's been in control. So you have a shift. And I'm really interested in whether those pathways to communication are going to open up so that there's at least more awareness to answer his question. Because my view is, it gets back into which Europeans you're talking to and what is the European view. Because the European view has been brewing for a while on this. Am I wrong, Stefan?
No, I think there's a big difference between the first and the second Trump administration. First, I think...
Well, we don't know what the second one's going to be.
When Trump was elected the first time, we thought this is an accident. And he didn't win the popular vote, and there's a small group and around him who tried to get this through. And he definitely got contained in the first Trump administration by the so-called adults. This time it's rather different, because I think he has now really a broad group of loyalists who are supporting him and to have administrative experience. And I think the challenge for Europe is quite different from the first administration. Then we try to muddle through, but I think this won't be sufficient for the years to come.
What's happening in your government?
In Germany? Difficult to say. It adds another uncertainty to.
I mean, is there volcanic populism coming in Germany?
No, I don't see that. Of course, we have right-wing and left-wing populism strengthened, but they don't exceed more than 25% on the national level. So no, I don't see that.
Right. Do you want to jump in real fast?
Yes, because I think it's a very important question, which was raised to know if Europeans are able to challenge, the Trump intellectually. I think it's very, very, very important. I don't think so. I think he was underestimated because this sort of, I would say, political pornography masks, in my opinion, a deep and real ideological transformation, of course, of the Republican Party, but outside also the Republican Party, which is not yet very well understood in Europe.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm very old-fashioned, when I say that moderation, nuances continue to be important in European political culture. I think it's important. But now we will face everywhere in the world, especially in Europe, many, many little Trumps. People who will campaign, with post-truth approach.
Right.
And only to establish facts will become a sort of political challenge. And I think, yes, you're right, we are underprepared to that. Let me add one thing.
Really quick.
I think that Trump is compatible with, the agreement between China and Russia signed in February 2022, just before the Russian assault, with the so-called unlimited friendship between China and Russia. Why? 3 key points. The first one is to say great power, sphere of influence.
Right.
Trump would agree. Second, human rights. That's not only boring, that's dangerous. And many, many countries would agree on that because it is seen. And the last one is military alliances are not so important. On these 3 points, Trump is compatible with Xi and Putin.
Paolo, let me get these last 2 questions in. Sayed, Sajidpour, there we go. Fast questions, and then we'll get fast answers, and we'll finish on time.
Okay, very interesting panel, and I thank everybody. But I have 2 questions and maybe 3. One is on the normative Europe. It was referred that Europe has the regulatory power or normative power. Since there was no reference to the Middle East, and of course, Dr. Magri mentioned that Europe.
Real short, Sayed, because we're out of time.
Europe knows its problem. Don't you think that Europe has lost its normative power because of the conflict in the Middle East and it didn't support? The second quick question is, I listened to the panel, I feel Europe psychologically is in confusion. Can we have a psychological reading of Europe and how it is?
Great, thank you. And Dalal.
Thank you very much. And going back to your anchoring point on this very interesting session, you talked about populism, and I want to stress on that point when it comes to the case of Germany and the raison d'etat of Germany. This year, a new dimension has been added when the citizenship law had been reformed by adding questions to the list of naturalization that has to do with Israel's right to exist, etc., etc. In the past 10 years, 29.7% of Israel's weapons have been provided from Germany. So where does Germany find itself in its leadership role in this world as part of the EU versus its relation with the US vis-a-vis the Middle East? Thank you.
Got it. Thank you. All right. So we have questions about normative Europe, psychology in Europe, and Germany, and all those weapons to Israel. Stefan.
Well, I was afraid of this question because I think that this is really, for Germany, a very thorny and tricky issue, and that I don't have to explain to you what our history is and why this history leads us to certain conclusions that we have to be that we need to be solidarity. What is that?
Right, Paolo?
The question on normative Europe, if we have lost in the conflict in the Middle East, I can't answer in 2 words. I can only say that we have all lost something in the conflict in the Middle East, and we will have the Rome Med conference on the Middle East in 2 weeks' time, and this will be one of the topics we will address. I can't answer in 30 seconds.
Thomas?
Well, it's a question of psychology of Europe. Listen, if I count, you know, the CV coming from, for instance, Iran, coming from different areas of the world, from Gulf countries, from Russia, from Ukraine, from Asia, from African countries, to work, you know, in a European think tank like mine, I think that Europe is very open to the world, and that's basically our main psychology.
And Nickolay, I'm going to give you the last word, but as you respond, I want 2 words on the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy and how you look as a previous under the tent, now you're out of the tent looking in, what our blind spots were in this conversation.
All right, let me first answer a question, then I'll respond very quickly. First, I think...
Don't forget my question.
First, I think it's, you know, Europe has been absolutely united both on Ukraine and the Middle East. On the Ukraine, it's been united in doing a lot to help the Ukrainian people fight back Russian invasion. On the Middle East, it's been united by doing nothing. Right. And I think this is a huge gap in Europe, because we miss Europe on the discussions related to the Middle East, and that is a huge failure, if you wish. Looking in and looking out, what I think we missed in the conversation perhaps is, you know, how is Europe perceived from the outside, and what actually Europe can still do beyond Ukraine and, if you wish, the Middle East. But in terms of politically, Europe has a huge role that it can play in terms of the Sahel, in terms of Africa. We completely didn't talk about that, and we really didn't reflect, I think, enough on how Europe's policies are perceived from the outside, because I think that is a whole different perspective than the one that we gave in the past.
So that, after some, that means we need a part 2 to this panel. I completely agree, and it was wonderful discussion. Nickolay Mladenov of the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy, great to have you. Paolo Magri of the Managing Director of the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, Stefan Mair, Director of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, wonderful to be with you, and Thomas Gomart, Director of the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI. Thank you. Big round of applause. Thank you all so much.